Millionaire CEO promised her a one-night stand only, but the next night he waited 2 hours outside. The air inside the Lancaster Grand Hotel was thick with wealth and ambition. It was one of those nights where New York's elite gathered under golden chandeliers, sipping champagne and exchanging power-laden conversations. The event? A highly anticipated business gala hosted by Julian Lancaster, the man who controlled some of the world's most prestigious luxury hotels. While the November wind outside was cutting through the streets, the ballroom itself radiated warmth, not just from the crystal chandeliers or the finely aged whiskey, but from the undeniable energy of people who thrived on influence. At the center of it all stood Julian Lancaster. Dressed in a custom-tailored black suit, he looked as composed as ever. Every move was deliberate, every glance calculated. As the CEO of Lancaster Holdings, he wasn't just another businessman, he was a strategist. And tonight, just like any other public appearance, he was playing his role flawlessly, until she caught his eye. Across the room, Evelyn Pierce was anything but subtle. Unlike the other journalists who blended into the background in their neutral-tone suits, she stood out in an emerald green dress, elegant but undeniably bold. Her auburn waves cascaded over her shoulders, and her sharp green eyes gleamed with something far more dangerous than admiration. Curiosity. She wasn't here to applaud Julian Lancaster. She was here to study him. Julian had long mastered the art of controlling a room, but Evelyn wasn't an audience member. She was a player. He watched as she slowly made her way through the crowd, never rushing, never hesitating. She was the kind of journalist who didn't write soft pieces like "The Secrets to a CEO's Success." No, Evelyn Pierce exposed the cracks in their perfect facades. And Julian Lancaster had no intention of letting her find one in his. The moment she stopped in front of him, her lips curved into a knowing smile, one that told him she wasn't here for pleasantries. "You despise the press, so why throw a press event?" Her voice was smooth, casual, yet laced with hidden amusement. A lesser man might have faltered under that directness, but Julian barely blinked. "I don't hate the press. I only hate inaccurate reporting." Evelyn took a slow sip of her champagne. She wasn't impressed. "Well, that's lucky for you," she mused. "I don't write fiction, just the truth." Julian tilted his head slightly, assessing her. She wasn't bluffing. She was daring him to challenge her. And for the first time that evening, Julian allowed himself a rare private smirk, not one crafted for the cameras or his investors, but just for her. "Then I look forward to reading what you write about me." The event carried on, filled with fleeting conversations and clinking glasses. But for Julian and Evelyn, the real game had only just begun. Hours later, as the gala drew to a close, she found herself lingering, not in the grand ballroom, but somewhere far quieter. Most guests had already left, their designer shoes clicking against the marble floors as they disappeared into chauffeured town cars. The only ones who remained were the ones who never truly called it a night. Investors sealing last-minute deals, socialites reveling in expensive champagne, and journalists waiting for an off-the-record scoop. And Evelyn Pierce. She wasn't in a hurry to leave. Sitting at the rooftop bar of the Lancaster Grand Hotel, she swirled the golden liquid in her glass, savoring the burn of whiskey against her throat. The city stretched out beneath her, a glittering sea of lights, each window hiding its own untold stories. Evelyn lived for stories, and tonight she had found an interesting one: Julian Lancaster. She hadn't expected him to join her, yet there he was, taking the seat next to her as if he owned it. "Journalists don't have working hours?" His voice was smooth, laced with amusement. Evelyn barely glanced at him. "CEOs don't have better things to do?" Julian chuckled. A real laugh this time, not the polite, calculated one she had seen at the gala. "Touché." For a while they sat in silence, the cool breeze playing with the loose strands of her auburn hair. Evelyn studied him from the corner of her eye. Most men in Julian's position were predictable. They either tried to charm their way into control or avoid her like the plague. Julian Lancaster did neither. Instead, he engaged, calculated, composed, but intrigued. She liked that. One drink turned into two, then three. The conversation drifted from business strategies to the absurdity of the wealthy. "So, how many identical suits do you own?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Let me guess. At least 6, all in varying shades of powerful CEO black? Julian smirked, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. 8, actually. Perfection requires consistency. Evelyn rolled her eyes. Perfection? Sounds more like an expensive way to be boring. Julian leaned in slightly. That glint of challenge returned to his gaze. And yet, here you are, still talking to me? Damn, she wasn't supposed to find him this interesting. Somewhere between the 4th and 5th drink, the lines blurred. She remembered laughter echoing under the stars. Julian's deep gray eyes locked onto hers. The way he leaned in just a fraction too close. And then, everything else was a haze. A sliver of sunlight crept through the curtains, landing directly on Evelyn's face. She groaned, turning over, and immediately knew something was very, very wrong. The bed was too soft, not hers. There was a scent in the air, sandalwood and something undeniably masculine. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, and there he was, Julian Lancaster. Her pulse stuttered, then raced. The man she had spent the night trying to outmaneuver was lying beside her, his expression infuriatingly calm, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Meanwhile, her own thoughts were a chaotic mess. Her dress on the floor, her heels near the door, a tie wrapped around the chair's armrest. Damn it. Oh, hell, no. Her head throbbed, but her mind worked fast enough to process the situation. Her dress on the floor, her heels kicked near the door, a tie wrapped around the armrest of a chair. Damn it. Flashes of last night resurfaced, his fingers at her waist, the heat of his mouth against hers, the way he laughed when she called him insufferable. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. No. She wasn't the type to panic over a one-night stand, but she also wasn't the type to wake up next to a billionaire CEO who could make her life unnecessarily complicated. She turned her head slightly. Julian was still asleep. Annoyingly peaceful, she needed to leave immediately. She moved quickly, slipping into her dress while scanning the room for her belongings. Once she was ready, she hesitated for only a second before grabbing a piece of paper from the desk. She scribbled a quick note. Thanks for a fun night. No flowery words, no lingering attachments. Placing it on the pillow, she smoothed her hair and tiptoed toward the door. She didn't look back. Julian Lancaster hated mornings. They always arrived too early, too bright, and usually dragged in tedious board meetings. But today, something was worse than the morning itself. She was gone. With a groggy sigh, he opened his eyes, still heavy from last night's whiskey. He turned over, expecting to find warm, tangled sheets in the presence of the woman who had completely shattered his expectations. Instead, all that remained was the cold emptiness of the bed and a small note resting on the pillow. Julian propped himself up on one elbow, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he picked up the note. Thanks for a fun night. 8 words, short, dismissive. She had actually left before he woke up. Julian leaned back against the headboard, one hand resting on his forehead, the other holding the note. For the first time in his life, he was the one left behind. Julian Lancaster had never been the man waiting for an answer, never been the one grasping at the remnants of something unfinished. But now here he was, holding nothing but a damn note. And for the first time, the game didn't feel like it was in his control anymore. Women never walked away first, and yet she had. A smirk tugged at his lips, a mixture of amusement and irritation flickering in his stormy gaze. Evelyn Pierce, do you really think you can walk away that easily? Because if she did, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Julian Lancaster did not lose. Not in business, not in negotiations, and certainly not in situations like this. Yet here he was, holding a damn note, left behind by a woman who had treated him like just another fleeting encounter. It was almost amusing. Almost. Because if Evelyn Pierce thought she could walk away without a second thought, she had severely underestimated him. It started the next morning. Evelyn sat in her usual corner booth at a small cafe in Soho, typing furiously on her laptop. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the soft chatter of early risers provided a comforting background noise. She had just taken a sip of her cappuccino when a deep voice interrupted. "What are you writing today?" Her fingers froze over the keyboard. She looked up, and there he was, Julian Lancaster, sitting across from her, undoing the button on his coat as if he had every right to be there. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "What are you doing here?" Julian picked up a menu, entirely unfazed. "Having coffee." Her brow arched. "There are hundreds of cafes in New York, as some are." Julian smirked, setting the menu aside. "What a coincidence, then." Evelyn scoffed, shaking her head. This was no coincidence. "You do realize this is borderline stalking, right?" Julian took a sip of his coffee, his expression entirely unbothered. "Stalking implies subtlety. I prefer a more direct approach." Damn him. Evelyn thought she had seen the last of him for the day. She was wrong. By mid-afternoon, she was back at the New York Chronicle, her workplace, determined to focus. She had barely sat down when her colleague Sophie peeked over from the next desk, eyes gleaming with mischief. "There's a man waiting for you at reception." Evelyn barely glanced up. "Tell him I'm busy," Sophie smirked. "Oh, I think you'll want to see this one." A sense of foreboding crept over her. No way. But sure enough, when she reached the lobby, Julian was standing there, dressed in a sharp black suit, looking as confident as ever. "What the hell are you doing here?" Julian checked his watch casually. "Lunch." Evelyn crossed her arms. "I have plans." Julian tilted his head. "With who?" "None of your business," he chuckled. "I'm in no rush. I'll wait." And he did, for 3 hours. By the time she finished work and stepped out, he was still there, leaning against his sleek black car, hands in his pockets, looking entirely too smug. "Do you seriously have nothing better to do?" she asked, exasperation creeping into her voice. "I have plenty to do." Julian pushed off the car, stepping closer. "But only one thing seems more important right now." Evelyn stared at him. This man was insufferable, and yet, her heart was beating just a little too fast. By the time the weekend rolled around, Evelyn was certain Julian had moved on, until she saw him at the Rutherford Foundation charity gala. Dressed in a classic black tux, he looked entirely at ease, as if he hadn't spent the past week actively disrupting her life. He spotted her before she could turn away. "You're late," he murmured as he stepped beside her. Evelyn nearly choked on her champagne. Why are you even here?" Julian lifted his glass, his stormy gray eyes glinting. "I'm the main sponsor of this event." Of course he was. Evelyn exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You are ridiculous. And yet, you're still talking to me." Before she could retort, the room fell silent as the auction began. The host introduced the next item, a luxurious private getaway to Italy, complete with 5-star accommodations and Michelin star dining. "Bidding starts at $50,000, the auctioneer announced. A few contenders raised their paddles. Then Julian's voice cut through the air. $150,000. The room stilled. Even the auctioneer hesitated before regaining composure. $150,000. Do we have a higher bid? Silence. Going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Lancaster. Applause erupted, but Evelyn wasn't clapping. She turned to Julian, arms crossed. You didn't have to go to such lengths just to impress me. Julian arched a brow. Who said I bought it for you? Evelyn scoffed. Then I suppose I'll wait to see who your lucky companion is. She was about to walk away when the auctioneer's voice rang out again. As per tradition, the winner must now announce who they'll be taking on this luxurious getaway. Evelyn froze. She turned back slowly, only to find Julian already looking at her. A smirk played at the corner of his lips. Evelyn Pierce, do you like Italy? The room went silent. Evelyn's breath hitched. This man. Are you trying to bribe me with a lavish vacation? She challenged. Julian took a slow sip of his champagne before replying. I'm just curious to see if you can resist Italy. The air between them shifted. Evelyn did love Italy. More importantly, she loved the game. And she had just realized Julian Lancaster was an opponent worth playing against. Evelyn tightened her grip around the champagne flute, her gaze locked onto Julian Lancaster, the man who had just casually used a charity auction to corner her into making a move. The air in the grand ballroom seemed to thicken as people eagerly awaited her response. She hated being maneuvered into a position where she had to make a decision in front of an audience. But what irritated her more was that Julian knew she wouldn't walk away from a challenge. She narrowed her eyes, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. "Do you really think a luxurious vacation is going to win me over?" Julian took his time, sipping his champagne, as if he had all the patience in the world. "No, but I think it'll intrigue you." Damn him. He was right. Evelyn hated predictability, and Julian Lancaster was anything but predictable. If she rejected the offer outright, it would be admitting that he had managed to unsettle her. If she accepted, well, at least she could control how this game played out. Setting down her glass, she folded her arms. "Fine, Lancaster, I'll go." For a split second, something flickered in Julian's expression, almost like surprise, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that familiar smirk. "Good. The jet leaves Friday." Evelyn turned to walk away, but paused just before leaving, casting him a glance over her shoulder. "I hope you're not one of those boring tour guides who drones on about history. I hate listening to lectures from self-important CEOs." Julian let out a low chuckle. "And I'm curious to see if you can resist Italy." 3 days later, Florence, Italy. Julian Lancaster's private jet touched down at Florence's airport beneath a golden autumn sky. As Evelyn stepped off the aircraft, she had to admit, Italy had a way of seducing people effortlessly. The terracotta rooftops, the winding cobblestone streets, the intoxicating mix of espresso and freshly baked bread in the air, it was all exactly as she had imagined. Julian descended behind her, exuding his usual unshaken confidence. He didn't need to announce his presence. It was simply felt. Without a word, he gestured toward a sleek Bentley waiting nearby, and within minutes they were gliding through the historic streets of Florence. "You seem familiar with this place," Evelyn observed, watching him from the corner of her eye as he leaned back against the seat. "Italy is one of my favorite destinations," Julian replied smoothly. "I like things that stand the test of time. Architecture, art, culture." Evelyn arched a brow. "Interesting, because I like uncovering the things people try to keep hidden." Julian turned his head to face her, his stormy gray eyes assessing her words. "Is that so? And this time, Evelyn, what exactly are you hoping to uncover?" She tilted her head slightly, a playful yet challenging glint in her gaze. "Guess we'll find out." Venice, a bold move. The next day they arrived in Venice. The floating city was as breathtaking as Evelyn had always imagined, its canals weaving through centuries-old buildings, adorned with ivy and flower-filled balconies. When Julian led her toward a private gondola waiting at the dock, she let out a soft chuckle. "I would have thought you were more of a luxury yacht kind of guy." Julian stepped onto the boat effortlessly, extending a hand toward her. "Occasionally, I enjoy tradition." Evelyn hesitated just a second before placing her hand in his, letting him help her into the gondola. The boat glided smoothly over the emerald water, passing under picturesque bridges and alongside charming Venetian cafes. The golden hues of sunset painted everything in warm light, making the moment feel almost unreal. As they drifted under the famous Rialto Bridge, Julian spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "Do you believe in legends?" Evelyn leaned back slightly, studying him. "Which one are we talking about?" Julian's gaze flickered toward the bridge. "They say that if two people kiss under the Rialto Bridge at sunset, they'll be bound together forever." Evelyn let out a soft laugh. "Are you planning to test that theory?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, before he slowly leaned in, closing the space between them. His lips hovered just a fraction away, waiting, not demanding, not forcing, just giving her a choice. She could stop this. She could pull back, but she didn't. Instead, she met him halfway. The kiss wasn't hurried or reckless. It was measured, deliberate, like a question posed between two people who weren't sure of the answer yet, but were more than willing to explore it. When they finally parted, Julian tilted his head, his voice low and smooth. "So, do you believe in legends now?" Evelyn held his gaze, her green eyes flickering with something unspoken. Then a slow smirk played on her lips. "I don't believe in legends. But I do believe in Italian wine and pizza. Julian chuckled, shaking his head slightly. I think I'm starting to enjoy the way you think, Pierce. Evelyn knew the game wasn't over, but for the first time she realized, whether she won or lost, she was thoroughly enjoying every moment of it. The Amalfi Coast stretched before them like a dream, cliffs towering over the deep blue sea, pastel-colored villages tucked between the hills, and winding roads that promised breathtaking views at every turn. The sun had just begun its slow descent, casting warm golden hues over the coastline. Evelyn stood at the edge of the villa's terrace, a glass of wine in her hand, watching as the waves crashed against the rocks below. She was supposed to be enjoying this trip. She had promised herself she wouldn't let Julian get into her head, and yet with every passing moment, she felt the balance between them shift, felt something unfamiliar creeping into the spaces between their usual banter. A presence behind her made her turn. Julian had joined her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his slacks, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy with something unspoken. You look like you have something on your mind, she mused, swirling the wine in her glass. Julian let out a soft breath, his voice lower than usual. I thought this was just a game. Evelyn glanced at him, eyebrow raised. And? His gray eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. I was wrong. She hadn't expected that answer. Evelyn had played this game before, pushing limits, testing reactions, keeping people at arm's length. She knew the rules, but Julian Lancaster wasn't just another opponent, and this wasn't just another game. Somewhere between their sharp words and quiet challenges, something had changed, and now here they were. She could feel the tension in the air, the shift from calculated moves to something far more dangerous. Julian took a step closer. I don't want you to disappear on me again. Evelyn's grip on her glass tightened. That night in New York, when she had walked away first, she had done it to keep control, to keep herself from falling into something she couldn't afford. But now, standing here, looking at Julian, she wasn't sure if walking away was an option anymore. Evelyn. His voice was softer now, but there was no mistaking the intent behind it. She could still turn this into a joke, pretend none of it mattered, but she didn't want to. Instead, she did the one thing neither of them expected. She kissed him first. The second their lips met, something in her unraveled. This wasn't a battle for control, not anymore. This was something else entirely, something neither of them had planned for. When they finally pulled apart, Julian studied her for a long moment, his fingers still resting lightly against her waist. Does this mean you're done running? Evelyn let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. No promises, Julian smirked. Good, I like a challenge. Evelyn knew they weren't out of the woods yet. There were still battles ahead, still things they hadn't said. But for now, she let herself get lost in the moment, in the feeling of Julian Lancaster's arms around her, in the realization that, for once, she wasn't trying to win. Because maybe, just maybe, this time, winning wasn't the point. It had started. The whispers, the headlines, the speculation. Julian Lancaster had always been a man under scrutiny, but this was different. For the past decade, his name had only ever been associated with business triumphs, power plays, and billion-dollar deals. He had been the cold, untouchable CEO, a man whose personal life was nothing more than a shadow behind his corporate empire. And now he was the subject of relentless media coverage. Not for a business move, not for an acquisition, but for a woman, Evelyn Pierce. Her name was everywhere. The press had latched onto the story like vultures to fresh meat. The woman who tamed Julian Lancaster? Scandalous affair or power play? From journalist to billionaire's obsession? Who is Evelyn Pierce? Evelyn had expected it. She had spent years dissecting stories just like this. Except now, she was the story. And Julian didn't seem to give a damn. The Lancaster estate was a monument to old money, a sprawling mansion surrounded by pristine gardens and an air of quiet authority. It was the kind of place that spoke not just of wealth but of legacy. And seated at the grand dining table, dressed in an elegant black dress, Evelyn faced her most formidable opponent yet, Eleanor Lancaster. Julian's mother, a woman of impeccable grace, razor-sharp intellect, and standards so high they were nearly unattainable. Eleanor sipped her wine slowly, studying Evelyn over the rim of her glass. "Miss Pierce, I've heard quite a bit about you." Evelyn smiled unfazed. "I hope some of it was good." Eleanor set her glass down, tilting her head ever so slightly. "A bold, outspoken journalist who built her career on exposing people like us? I highly doubt that everything I've heard has been positive." Evelyn could feel the unspoken challenge in every syllable. Julian, seated beside her, remained relaxed, watching the exchange like it was an interesting chess match. He wasn't going to intervene. This was a battle Evelyn had to fight herself. So she leaned in slightly, her expression unreadable. "Honesty is a virtue, Mrs. Lancaster." Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Virtue is a matter of perspective, my dear. And my perspective is that Julian has always been selective with the company he keeps." There it was, the not-so-subtle implication that Evelyn wasn't the right kind of woman for him. Evelyn could have backed down. She could have played nice. But she wasn't built that way. She placed her wine glass down, locking eyes with Eleanor. "Tell me, Mrs. Lancaster, do you think a woman who fits into your definition of perfection would actually make Julian happy?" Silence. For the first time, Eleanor Lancaster blinked. Julian's smirk deepened. Now, this was getting interesting. Evelyn didn't stop there. "Your son isn't the kind of man who thrives in monotony. If he wanted someone simply to sit beside him at high society events, we wouldn't be having this conversation, would we?" The air in the room shifted. Eleanor studied Evelyn for a long moment, then exhaled quietly, setting her fork down. "You're not easily intimidated, are you?" Evelyn smiled. "I deal with powerful men for a living." A pause, then Eleanor Lancaster laughed, a rare quiet chuckle, but Julian recognized it immediately. She wasn't convinced, but she was impressed, and that in itself was a victory. As the dinner carried on, Julian leaned toward Evelyn, his voice low and amused. "You just did something no one else has ever done." She arched a brow. "Which is?" "Made my mother question her own logic." Evelyn smirked. "Good, because I have no intention of being predictable." Julian looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Then with a smirk of his own, he lifted his glass. "Neither do I." The following morning, Evelyn walked into the New York Chronicle with her usual cup of coffee, only to be met with dozens of stares. She sighed, placing her bag on her desk. "All right, get it over with." Matt, one of the senior journalists, leaned against her desk, grinning. "So, our queen of investigative journalism has now become the billionaire's muse?" Evelyn gave him a deadpan look. "If I throw this coffee at you, would that still be considered professional misconduct?" Linda, her closest colleague, was more serious. "Evelyn, are you sure this is worth it? Julian Lancaster isn't exactly known for relationships. He's famous for burning through them faster than most people go through coffee." Evelyn took a slow sip. "I know." Matt crossed his arms. "So, tell me, is this just another game to you?" Evelyn tapped her nails against her coffee cup. She hated being analyzed, but she also knew that avoiding the question would only invite more speculation. "If he's playing a game," she said finally, "then I'll be the opponent who doesn't play fair." The newsroom fell silent. Then Matt let out a low whistle. "God, I love how you convince yourself of things." Linda, however, remained unconvinced. "I just don't want you to get hurt." Evelyn met her friend's gaze. "If anyone should be worried, it's Julian." Meanwhile, on the other side of New York, Julian had his own war to fight. The whispers among high society had begun. "Did you hear? Julian Lancaster is dating a journalist? Not a socialite, not an heiress, but a woman whose career is built on uncovering secrets? She could ruin him." Julian heard every word. He didn't care. Seated in his office, he scrolled through the latest headlines. They were ruthless, each one trying to define his relationship with Evelyn, trying to spin it into something scandalous. Across from him, his assistant cleared his throat. "Sir, would you like to issue a statement?" Julian smirked. "No." The assistant hesitated. "But the press?" "I said no." Julian leaned back, exuding complete confidence. They can speculate all they want. He glanced at his phone, at a message from Evelyn. Evelyn, I hope you know you're the #1 trending topic right now. Enjoy the fame, Lancaster. Julian chuckled before typing back. Julian, does that mean I finally have your attention, Pierce? He hit send, then leaned back in his chair. Let the world talk, because at the end of the day, only one opinion really mattered, and she was already playing the game. Evelyn Pierce never imagined herself settling down with anyone. She wasn't the type to believe in happy endings, nor had she ever dreamed of a love story straight out of a movie. But Julian Lancaster wasn't just anyone. He didn't simply walk into her life. He shattered every wall she had built, piece by piece, until she had nowhere left to run. When she woke up the next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the man lying beside her. Julian was still asleep, one arm draped lazily over her waist, his breathing steady and calm. For the first time, Evelyn didn't feel the urge to leave. No instinct telling her to reclaim control. No panic at the thought of lingering too long. Just peace, something she had never truly known before. She carefully shifted, attempting to slip out of bed, but before she could, a deep, sleepy voice rumbled beside her. Thinking of running again, Pierce? She stilled, turning to find Julian watching her, eyes half-lidded, lips curved into a knowing smirk. She huffed a laugh and lay back down, resting her head on his arm. Not exactly, but you know, I'm not used to waking up and still being here. Julian studied her, his gray eyes holding something softer than usual. Then you should get used to it. She gazed at him, her heartbeat slowing in a way that felt different. Not from adrenaline, not from anticipation, but from something quieter, something more certain. Are you always this confident? She murmured. Julian lifted a hand, brushing his fingers along the curve of her cheek. Not confidence, he corrected. Certainty. Evelyn could have listed 1,000 reasons why this wouldn't last, why their worlds were too different, why it was bound to fall apart. But for once, she didn't want to, because deep down, beneath all the logic and skepticism, she knew one thing. She didn't want to leave. Julian saw the hesitation flicker across her face, but he didn't push. He just waited. And after a long pause, Evelyn sighed, resting her head against his chest. Damn you, Lancaster. You're ruining my ability to make rational decisions. Julian chuckled, pulling her closer. I'll take that as a compliment. And for the first time, Evelyn Pierce wasn't thinking about running. New York's elite had never been more shocked. Julian Lancaster, the cold, ruthless CEO who never let anyone close, was getting married. And not to a high-profile socialite, not to a famous actress, but to a journalist. But to a woman whose career was built on exposing the secrets of people like him. Has Julian Lancaster lost his mind? A love story or a calculated move? She could ruin him. The headlines kept coming, but this time Evelyn didn't care. Their wedding was held at a stunning estate overlooking Lake Como, Italy. Unlike the extravagant, over-the-top affairs expected of billionaires, their ceremony was intimate but undeniably elegant. An open-air setting, white silk draped softly in the breeze, the finest Italian wine flowing freely, and a guest list that consisted only of those who truly mattered. When Evelyn walked down the aisle, she wasn't wearing a traditional princess gown. Instead, she had chosen something sleek, sophisticated, and unapologetically her. A minimalist dress that hugged her form, with a thin silk ribbon cinching at the waist. Her eyes, sharp as ever, locked onto the man waiting at the altar. Julian, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, never took his eyes off her. As she reached him, he leaned in just slightly, voice low and teasing. Are you sure about this? There's still time to run. Evelyn smirked. Who says I need to run when I've already won? Julian let out a soft chuckle, tightening his grip on her hand. And as the officiant spoke, neither of them really heard the words. Because for them, this was never the ending. This was just the start of a new game, one they would play together, where neither of them had to win. If anyone thought marriage would mellow Julian and Evelyn Lancaster, they were terribly mistaken. The morning debates over business strategies and politics were still a part of their daily routine. The sharp teasing, the back-and-forth challenges, it never stopped. And every time someone asked who had the upper hand in their relationship, Julian would simply turn to Evelyn. And Evelyn? She would smirk and say, "Depends on who's having the sharper day." A year later, they were still two forces of nature, still two people who refused to yield. But now they had chosen to fight alongside each other instead of against each other. Because at the end of the day, they both knew one undeniable truth. This was never about winning or losing. It was about finding someone worth never playing the game alone again. If anyone thought marriage would soften Julian Lancaster, they were dead wrong. However, if anyone thought he could still control every aspect of his life after marrying Evelyn Pierce, they were even more wrong. Because now Julian wasn't just dealing with one sharp, relentless woman who never backed down. He was facing two miniature versions of her, equally intelligent and dangerously cunning. Ethan and Evie Lancaster. Ethan, methodical and thoughtful, studied his father with calculating eyes, as if he were analyzing a business move. Meanwhile, Evie leaned forward on her elbows, mischief practically radiating from her. One was waiting for an answer. The other was waiting for an opportunity to cause chaos. When Julian Lancaster thought of power, he thought of boardrooms, billion-dollar negotiations, and making CEOs tremble in their seats. But real power was currently sitting across the dinner table from him. It all started at dinner. Julian was savoring a rare moment of peace, sipping his wine, when Evie, only 5 years old, propped her chin on her hand and studied him intently. "Daddy," she said in the most innocent tone. But Julian knew a storm was coming. He placed his glass down slowly. "Yes, sweetheart?" Evie blinked at him. "Today I read in the newspaper that people call you the most charming bastard in finance. What does that mean?" Julian choked on his wine. Evelyn nearly dropped her fork as she tried to suppress a laugh. Ethan, ever the logical one, nodded in agreement. "I saw that too. Are you really a bastard, Dad?" Julian rubbed his temples. "Where are you two seeing these things?" Evie took a bite of bread, chewing thoughtfully. "Aunt Sophie from Mommy's office showed me." Evelyn snorted. "Looks like Sophie needs a little reminder about appropriate workplace conversations." Julian shot his wife a look. "You think this is funny?" Evelyn shrugged, completely unapologetic. "I think it's entertaining." Julian turned back to the twins, now watching him with expectant expressions. "All right, listen, it's complicated, but the short answer is no, I am not a bastard." Ethan frowned. "But Uncle Richard said you're too dangerous in negotiations?" Julian sighed, leaning back. "Dangerous doesn't mean bad." Evie tilted her head. "Then what does it mean?" Julian exhaled, glancing at Evelyn as if asking for backup. She merely raised an eyebrow, her expression saying, "You can handle hostile takeovers, but not your own kids." He turned back to them, choosing the simplest explanation. "It means I'm very good at my job." Evie blinked. Then she turned to Ethan. "So he's very good at being a bastard." Julian nearly slammed his head on the table. Evelyn, she was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes. A week later, Julian was deep in a critical meeting when his assistant knocked on the door, looking hesitant. "Sir, there's a visitor demanding to see you. I told them you were busy, but they insisted." Julian didn't look up from his documents. "Have them schedule an appointment. I don't take unannounced meetings." The assistant hesitated. "The thing is, it's Miss Evie." Julian immediately lifted his head. "What?" Before he could react, a clear, confident voice rang from the doorway. "Daddy, we need to talk." Evie Lancaster strode into his office like a miniature CEO, her curly hair pulled into a high ponytail, her bright green eyes filled with absolute purpose. Julian leaned back in his chair, barely holding back a smirk. "All right, sweetheart. What brings you here?" Evie pulled out a chair, sat down like she owned the place, and folded her hands on the desk. "I want to discuss my allowance." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Your allowance?" Evie nodded firmly. "Yes, $5 a week is unacceptable. I did some calculations, and adjusting for inflation, I should be getting at least 10. Julian stared at her for a long moment. Then he burst out laughing. "Really? You calculated inflation?" Evie nodded again, completely serious. "Yes, if you want, I can present my findings in a PowerPoint." Julian glanced at his assistant, who was barely containing their amusement. Can you set up a financial review meeting for Miss Lancaster next week? The assistant coughed to hide their laughter. Of course, sir. Evie looked pleased, standing up and extending her tiny hand like a businesswoman sealing a deal. Julian shook it, grinning. As she walked out, Ethan stood by the door, arms crossed. Ethan shrugged. I'm not getting involved, but if she wins, I want my cut too. Julian had never felt more outplayed in his life. Evelyn was right. He could rule the financial world, but when it came to his wife and kids, he was utterly powerless, and he wouldn't change it for anything.